Good afternoon and welcome. I'm not Tom Lovejoy, for those of you who know Tom, but we're sure he's on his way. He's probably delayed. So we thought when you have a full room, you get started. So given that you're here, we thought, and we have our panelists here, we'd like to go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Roger Mark D'Souza. I'm the Director of Population, Environmental Security, and Resilience here at the Wilson Center. And our President and CEO, Jane Harman, often describes the Wilson Center as an intellectual candy shop. So welcome to our candy shop, but she's quick to add, it's a place where you don't get fat on spin. So with that brief introduction, I'm not going to let Tom walk off the stage. He's going to walk right back up this way because he made it just in the nick of time. So Tom, welcome. Good to have you, and I'm going to let you introduce the panel and get started. Good to see you. Probably need a sip of water.
No, I'm fine.
No, you're good.
So thank you, Roger Mark, and my apologies for everybody for skittering in here at the last minute, but you can't always plan your day perfectly. So this whole series, the Managing Our Planet seminar, which is, I guess, going into something like its fourth year, had its genesis in realizing that a lot of the environmental challenges that we were facing basically have become planetary in scale, and that it really made sense not only to think about the individual pieces, but to try and look at some of those challenges generically and think about solutions on a planetary scale. And obviously you can't think about managing our planet, which of course is really about managing ourselves, but without really giving serious attention to the 2/3 of the planet which is covered by the oceans. And so that's what we have for this afternoon. Not that one can do it in an afternoon, but we have two speakers who bring a lot to that subject matter. And the first is my good friend Andreas, who actually sort of triggered this seminar in a conversation over lunch when I learned about 10 times more than I had known before about all of that. And actually my first brush with George Mason University had to do about a marine conservation conference led by Chris Parsons, my colleague in the Department of Environmental Science and Public Policy. So being mostly a terrestrial creature myself, I think I should shut up and let the experts go ahead. Andreas.
Thank you so much. I have only lived in DC for a year, after 34 years in California. So it's a bit of an adjustment for a California surfer. And Tom has been kind enough to take me a bit under his wing and make it easier. I work for an environmental organization, the Ocean Conservancy, but I promise you, I will not tell you a Cassandra story today. Although Cassandra is my favorite Greek story. It's about an incredibly beautiful, and I'm not sure she was a semi-goddess or a commoner, but Zeus fell in love with her and she possessed the incredible courage to turn him down. And Zeus, being like most Greek gods of rather pronounced degrees of narcissism, wanted to punish her in the worst way possible. And so he had already been done with, the eagle that comes and rips out the kidney once every 10 years to the guy chained to the rocks, and all of these easy punishments were done for. He had to find something really diabolical. So what he comes up with, of course, is he gave her the ability to see into the future, and understand the future. And he made sure that nobody believed her. And that's psychologically incredibly insightful, right? Because that's like the most painful thing. And of course, all environmentalists think of themselves as Cassandra. They think that they see very clearly the future, and the future is generally one of, we're all going to die, right? Things are really bad, and then nobody believes us, and we suffer, and that ennobles us. And so, we stick to that story. But today I will not tell a story of gloom and doom. We're going to talk about poker and risk and uncertainty and opportunity and fish and all kinds of things. But to basically start with the very end, I'm full of hope about the oceans, and I think we can figure this out, and we will figure this out. But it's going to take a lot of good thinking. And the title of this presentation is New Solutions for a Changing Ocean. And so the first word of that, or the last word of that, is ocean. And if you're an ocean activist these days, and it's probably true for any single sector activist, or like a forest activist or a population activist, and so you ask yourself, what does that really mean, right? I mean, in the ocean, the number 1 and 2 threats are climate change and overpopulation. So do we become suddenly population activists or climate change activists? That would mean we would dissipate. Do we stick to a strict ocean theme? Well, that would mean we probably miss the boat. So what does that really mean for us? It's a very interesting question, and we're going to get to that. But the big word here is the changing ocean, right? The ocean is fundamentally changing, and I'm not sure how many of you would admit to playing poker, but poker is a risk game. You know that if you're sitting on an inside straight, your chances of drawing to that about 1 in 11, and you can build a risk management system around that. Yes, it's a risk, but you can figure out pretty rationally, are you going to do it, are you not, are you going to bluff? It depends on what you think your opponents are holding and the face of your opponent and so on and so forth, right? That's risk. It's sort of a predetermined distribution of future outcomes, right? Uncertainty is you have no idea whether you're playing poker or whist or canasta, right? You are completely without a framework about what to do next. Doesn't mean necessarily that horrible things are going to happen, but your management framework has been taken away from you, and that's where we are basically in the oceans. We're moving from risk to uncertainty, and we'll talk a little bit how that all happens, right? And then new solutions. Well, we're going to need to, to tell you one thing, oceanographers aren't going to solve this, by themselves. We need them. We need fisheries managers. We need all the classic disciplines. But what's going to solve this in the long run is everything from behavioral economics to remote sensing to complexity to big data to, every conceivable discipline is going to have to work together to figure out a complex system like this. And it's not going to be done by making it much more complex yet. It's going to be done by making it much more simple. And we'll talk a little bit about that. That change happens basically around so many levels: chemistry, overfishing, pollution, marine debris. As you know, in chemistry, ocean acidification is going on. We have warmer waters everywhere. We have overfishing, which in some places in the world are vastly more pronounced than in others. We have, if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about pollution and marine debris, which is actually a real sleeper. But these are things that are fundamentally changing things from risk to uncertainty. So let's take a romp around the world and look at a few of these things that are going on. So this is an oyster bed. And oyster beds are interesting because the first industry that was ever existentially affected by ocean acidification is the oyster industry in washing. They couldn't get their fry to survive, and they wonder why that was. And they found out it's because the fry was being fried. The acidification was too high, right? And they had to do some very fancy plumbing, and they figured out a way to get this right, and so now they're back in business. But that was sort of the first bell rung. And ocean acidification is an interesting one, right? The interesting thing about it, it's not like climate change. Climate change is system science, right? You can never know whether that last blizzard or that last horrible extreme event was really due to climate change. All you can say is that it was generally in line with what you would expect in climate change. But climate change is a system science. It's a standard, is basically preponderance of evidence and verifiable claims, and people can mess with that and they can sow doubt, and they do it, and that's where the climate doubters have a lot of success. Ocean acidification is none of that. It's a high school experiment. It's good old-fashioned science by falsification, right? You crank up the CO2 in the atmosphere, the ocean gets more acidic every time, not some of the time, right? It's absolutely 100% causal. You can do it in your garage all night long, right? So in that sense, it's very important because it's one of those things that the doubters can't get out of, quite frankly. We can nail them on that, right? And it's beginning to show its head. Now, is it an ugly head? Well, you know, it depends. It's like your garden. Your azaleas love acid, right? Some others not so. Some other plants not so. And the ocean is the same way. This little guy is a pteropod, and they're really beautiful. They're little butterflies. They're called butterfly snails. They flitter around, and they're really lovely. They're also very tiny. And I'm not sure you can see it so well, but this thing is deteriorating pretty badly. And it's a photo of one that was basically submerged in water that was about as acidic as we expect the water to be about 30 years from now. So you can see it's not doing all that great, right? Other species are going to do much better, right? There'll be winners, there'll be losers. For a while, that will be probably even, they will be even, right? We don't know. It may be that we are going to have massive effects. We don't know. We're in the realm of uncertainty. We know for one thing, though, that eventually things are going to get bad, right? It's not going to go on forever, this winner and loser thing. So here's a chart. And I apologize, I'm going to throw just a few charts at you. But this is a map, and it shows you these contour lines, shows you basically a stuff called aragonite. And aragonite is a calcium carbonate, which shelled animals, carbon-based animals, use to make shells. And the deeper the red, the more undersaturated it is. So it makes sense, right? On the polar regions, we are pretty undersaturated, and there's not a whole lot of shells there, right? And in the equator, that's where all the coral reefs are. That's where all of the calcium carbonate is. The upper left-hand corner, we are seeing the CO2 saturation of the atmosphere. Now let's crank up, right? And let's crank up the CO2 and see what actually happens. So remember, the deeper the red, the more systematically underrepresented the water is with the stuff that half the food chain needs to make its essential shell. So here goes, and at first it just sort of wobbles along, nothing much happens, dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum. But then as you get into 400, 500, 600, things start going pretty red. And around 650, we have pervasive undersaturation of calcium. Not a good thing. Not a good thing at all, right? And it's not like it immediately kills animals. What it does is it puts a metabolic tax on them. If you're a little shell, you don't have a whole lot of energy. You know, you're filtering a few morsels of food every day. That's your budget, right? You got to do with it all those things. If you spend that budget making shell, something else has to not happen. And usually that's reproduction. You know, not tonight, honey. I'm really busy from making shells all day. And that, of course, is not so good for recruitment. That you have a problem there. And we're seeing this, right? So you all have heard the incredible variation we're now seeing on what, to me as a Californian, is so important, which is the salmon. You know, I remember giving it away from a friend's boat 10 years from now. There was so much of it. We couldn't even get price worthy enough to sell to a wholesaler. 1 year later, it disappeared. It didn't go down, right? It disappeared. So uncertainty. It always used to be some risk. You had a normal distribution, basically, of salmon that could happen. This was off the charts. Why is it? Well, his favorite food is those little shells I showed you. Maybe that happened. Maybe it has to do with currents changing. Maybe we don't know. It's just uncertainty. All right. So in keeping with that uncertain theme, let's go to a place that's nearer to us right here. This little guy is a haddock. It's a ground fish, and it's a pretty good fishery in the Gulf of Maine. And what happens every 3 or 4 years in the ocean, in American waters, is that the scientists from NOAA come in and they basically do a stock assessment. They look at the data of how many fish were landed by the fishermen, and they crank a big statistical analysis, and they figure out how many fish are in the sea, and then they tell you, okay, you can take out so many of those, and be pretty sure that the stocks are going to be fully recovered, not fully recovered, but somewhat recovered in somewhat sustainable next year. It's called maximum sustainable yield fishing, right? So they did that in 2012. They figured out there's a bunch of fish in the sea, and they set a quota, and they said, see you in 4 years, boys. So last year, the fishermen went out, and they went fishing. And they did some more fishing. And then they did some more fishing. And then they came in with a grand total of 4% of their quota. The fish had gone up and left, right? So what's going on here? Did their food disappear? Did they disappear? Did they slip down in search of cooler water? Did they go east? Did they go north? Did they go down? We have no idea. All we know is they disappeared overnight, an entire stock. And that's not the only one. Talk to a fisherman in the Gulf of Maine, and they will tell you, we have no idea. We don't recognize this ocean at all, right? We're catching seahorses and pufferfish and squid and tropical species suddenly. We're not catching cod. We're not catching haddock. The lobster are going nuts, hyperabundant, right? Monocultural, but we don't know what's going on, right? So here's another nasty chart, and I apologize about this, but it really tells the really scary part of the temperature and the stock fish, shifting story. There's two kinds of species, right? There's those that shift, that like to shift as things get warmer, and there's those that stay put. So the question is there any difference between the two? So here you see, on the left, the shifting species, and those are the non-shifting species. And this shows you the difference in terms of how long they get, how old they get when they're mature, and how long they get when they're fully mature, so maximum lengths, right? And what that basically says is the smaller you are, the more you shift. In other words, predator gets separated from prey. And indeed, if you look at it species by species, what we're seeing is the smallest stuff, the planktons, the zooplankton, has in the last decade moved as much as 1,000 miles in response to cooler waters. The medium stuff, the classic forage fish, the hyperprey, your anchovies that everybody eats, right? Up to 400 miles. Most of the predators, 40 miles, right? So you're seeing a systematic disaggregation of predator and prey as a response to warming waters, right? Now that prey is going into another predator's range, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be all terrible. It's just a regime shift, right? The ocean has an incredible, the ocean abhors a vacuum. Ask any fisherman and he or she will tell you, by the time I fished out one species, another one moves in, right? It's folly to say that we're fishing out the ocean. We're not fishing out the ocean. We may be impoverishing the ocean, however. We may be reducing the overall complexity of the ocean. Net, the ocean will always provide. But the question is, at what level of complexity and diversity and resilience and robustness and all of those things, right? So we need to keep that in mind. The lower pieces of this, these are curves about shifting, the degree to which species are shifting north, and all the way from hake to sculpin to shad and so on. And as you can see, the curve is not always the same slope and so on, but the trend is pretty clear. So what does it all mean? I'm a fishery manager, right? What does it all mean? So what you see here is your basic, what we call the trophic pyramid, right? It's your food chain. You've got predators on top, and you got prey at the bottom, or slime to prime, right? Algae down there and tuna up there. And it's an unbelievable system. So we take about a year, about 100 million tons worth of seafood out of the ocean, right? I fail to be able to grasp what 100 million tons of slippery fish actually looks like, but that's the number, right? Do you know how long it takes for the ocean to create 100 million tons of biomass at the bottom, at the algae level? 10 hours, right? So you got an avalanche of slime. Overwhelming or not overwhelming, as the case may be, relatively little prime. And the reason that it's not overwhelming that, right, is that the system is unbelievably well calibrated. This transfer of energy, all that biomass, right, going up this thing, is basically where all the good things happen. That's where the carbon gets stored. There's 40,000 gigatons of carbon in the ocean, which is a large number when you believe that climate change is caused by 40 gigatons per year. There's 40,000 gigatons stored in the ocean through this process, right? Every second breath you take in oxygen, 25% of the protein we need, all of the sort of climactic modulation that's going on, not all, but a whole lot of it, that all happens in this system, right? So actually that system doesn't quite look the way I described it. It looks like this, right? Relatively little predators on the top and a whole lot of prey and slime at the bottom, right? I don't mean in a derogatory. I say slime with all the love in my heart. So what are we doing to it, right? Well, we're cutting off the top. So we're favoring the slime over the prime. That's not so good, right? We're goosing the slime by pumping billions of tons of pounds of fertilizer into it and nutrients, right? We're changing the whole chemistry of the soup. And that's all, we're stressing a pretty darn essential system here. And it's not going to respond with a collapse, but it is going to change, right? And so the question is, how do we actually think about changing it? Managing that. How do you as a fishery manager, so again, the classic way of managing a fishery is species by species. Figure out how many there are, figure out how many you can catch, come back and tell the fishermen what to do, come back in 5 years. Thank you very much, right? What if you can't do that anymore? Because the species are shifting all over the place. You have absolutely no certainty that next year you're going to get there and you will find any hake, any salmon. You're not playing poker anymore. You're playing some game you've never seen before. How do you manage a system that is that fluid, that dynamic? Well, I mean, if you ask a manager in any other industry or software manager and so on, well, you got to be fast and you got to be adaptive and light on your feet and you have to have real data and real-time data and all these things, and we do none of these things, right? But what we especially don't do is that we don't manage the system. We manage one little piece of the system, one species at a time, right? And if we can't do one species at a time anymore, if we can't manage to the productivity of each species anymore, which is what we're currently doing, which everybody in the world is doing on industrial fisheries, then what is it that we're going to what quality do we manage this thing for, right? Well, the answer is we have to manage it to some quality of integrity, of resistance, of robustness, of resilience. We're going to have to manage it to the slope of this pyramid, right? We're going to have to make sure that there's always the same amount of relation of prey to predator, that there's always the same number of layers of different classes of animals, that the thing doesn't get crushed, right? We're going to have to introduce measures when before we were very deterministic and we were working with absolute values. We're now going to have to say, we don't want this thing to change more than this much per year. We don't want the fishing effort to be any less random than this, because a random effort by definition catches a little less off the top and a whole lot more on the bottom. Because it's random, you're going to get more slime than you're going to get prime, right? You're going to have to we're going to have to finally learn. This has been the dream for a long time, and that's why I'm actually optimistic. This crisis is going to push us to a place where we're going to have to manage the system as a whole interlocking chart. And we can't do that in a way where understanding every little last interaction between all the pieces. This would violate the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You cannot do that, right? You can know where every fish is and how fast it is, but you can't do both. You can not do that. It's too complex. But if we're really smart about it, we can figure out what the key indicators of health for a system like this really are, and we can manage to that, which might actually be a lot simpler than what we're doing now, right? So that's for industrial fisheries. And in a way, this is a dream we've had for a long time called ecosystem-based fisheries management. But it may be a much more elegant way of getting there than the way that we've looked at it before. So, but I've basically, so far I've just talked about basically species by species fishing. industrial fishing, northern fishing, single species fishing. There's a whole nother world out there, right? Let's go to the Philippines. This is a trawler in the Philippines. Those guys pull in about 50 species for every haul, right? Every net has about 40, 50, 60 species in it. You can't run a stock assessment on all of that. The interesting thing is there's 3,662 of these trawlers in the Philippines right now. They catch about half all the fish, 1.5 million tons. The other half of the fish is caught by 460,000 artisanal or municipal boats, right? So you got 3,500 boats catching as much as 450,000 boats. The catch has decreased per unit effort, has gone down 92% in the last 10 years with the introduction of these trawlers. So you got Peter, Robin from Paul, except that Peter is, Paul here, the municipal fisherman, this is an absolutely existential piece, right? Existential piece. They cannot afford a 90% decrease in their yield. Their kids will actually have protein deficiencies. They cannot feed their families. This has a deeply, deeply human cost, right? That story plays out all over the developing world. There is a vast overcapacity of commercial fishing. So how do you actually, and by the way, this is going to get worse because we're going to get 2 billion new people. And where are these people going to live? Here's a map of where they're going to live. And it's all going to be in Asia, where we have a problem with overcapacity to begin with, and a whole lot of them are going to live in coastal areas. Not good, right? And we already, we know that if you look at the lower graph here, the fleet capacity is the solid line, and the fleet productivity is the dotted line. So this tells the whole story, right? So what do we do with that? The World Bank and the aid organizations have gone in and spent a lot of money trying to teach fishing, to the fishery management organizations, the fisheries agencies in these countries, and that really hasn't worked because there are many reasons why this capacity, this overcapacity exists. The way that we're really going to have to go about that is this is no different, right, from any overinvestment in any commodity industry in the world. You put in too much money, you have too much capacity, your profitability goes south, but you're hanging in there anyways because you're afraid of creating all of these stranded assets, all of these boats that you've invested in. You can't strand them. You're still making a little bit of operating profits on all the boats. You're absolutely killing everything, but you're still making out a little bit of operating profit. And so this thing hangs in for far too long. So how do you actually do that? What you have to do is use the same methods that we've used to sunset any kind of, whether you're talking about coal in England, whether you're talking about mainframes, whether you're talking about bad coal plants. This happens all the time. We sunset unprofitable commodity industries all the time. And you do it by basically creating an incentive for the good actors to buying out the bad actors, and by getting liquidity into the game, and by insurance mechanisms into the game. So what we're doing is basically figuring out trying to figure out a whole new approach. I've taken about half the boats in the developing world out, not because somebody is telling them so, but as a matter of economic self-interest of the fleets themselves. And there's some pretty sophisticated engineering you can do around that, and we're working with folks on that. So that's to fishing. I could talk if you're interested, for 5 more minutes around something that's dear to my heart, which is something really prosaic, but actually quite interesting, which is trash. May I do that? You still with me for 5 minutes? All right. So you've heard about the gyres, the famous gyres, right, where all the plastic goes, right? Here's the North Pacific gyre. And it's basically, these are gyre systems, right? So all of the trash in the world goes into 5 of these gyres, and then they spit out the trash, and they land up on the beaches. We just came back from an expedition to Alaska, and we found that 80% of the trash from Alaska actually comes from Asia, right? And you can see why that is, right? It just gets from one gyre into another, and eventually it gets spit out up there, right? And it does damage, right? In we already knew that it does one kind of damage, which is seabirds eat it. This is an albatross that died horribly, right? It's a young chick, and the mother comes and has picked up bottle caps and then regurgitates it to the chick, and the chick eats it, and then it can't regurgitate it back up because its esophagus isn't developed yet, and they die by the hundreds of thousands, and you cut them up, and you find that they're full of bottle caps. It's disgusting, right? And it's sort of, it's such an iconic sort of manifestation of what's wrong with us. I mean, why do we let something like that happen? But it only tells 5% of the story, because I could say as an ecologist, the albatross are not in trouble and this is disgusting, but whatever. The much trickier story is this. We figured out, but we did a big analysis on this, and we figured out there's about 10 million tons of plastic goes into the water every year, right? So cumulatively, there's about 300 million tons. And it goes into these jars, and it gets ground up, and it ends up looking like that. That's a jar of water that we collected from the Pacific Gyre. Pretty disgusting, right? So then people went in and they did trawls through all these gyres, and they measured very carefully how much was in the nets behind the boats, what the trawls actually were. And then we were able to put all these together, and we extrapolated, and we figured out, all right, how much plastic is actually in these gyres, in the water. And we couldn't find more than 100,000 tons. So 300 million we know is in there. We can find 100,000. That's really weird, because 70% of all plastic floats. PET, PPT, all that stuff floats. So where is it? Where's Waldo? Right? There's only one explanation. It's inside animals. It was eaten, right? So that's really interesting, because there's probably only 700, 800 million tons of finfish in the water. And apparently, there's 300 million tons of plastic inside those finfish. So suddenly, this is not just a few albatross anymore, right? Suddenly, this has a completely different tone to it, which is a systematic poisoning of fish in the sea. And if you look at this for a little fish, this looks indistinguishable from a small piece of zooplankton, right? Or a small jellyfish or a small shell and so on. It's gleaming, it's translucent, quick bite, right? And then it goes into the food chain. There's a whole lot we don't know yet. We know it does damage. There's enough lab reports out now that we know it hurts fish, right? Cancer rates go up, liver cirrhosis or whatever goes up. What we don't know is to what degree that damage bioaccumulates and to what degree it actually gets into all of us as we eat our fish fingers, right? So that then it becomes a problem much bigger than an oceanographer like me can fix, because there's 8 producers of resin in the world that produce about 70% of the resin, and that's your Dows and your BASFs and your Cinetechs and so on. And then there's probably 1 million extruders that use that resin and make stuff with and sell it, and then it ends up in the ocean. So how do you intervene in that, right? What do you actually do? And I wish I could give you an answer yet on that. We're working on it. There's various proposals, but it's going to take a very deep breath by the world community to do this one. But I do think that once we get the word out that this is actually what this actually means, this is a systematic poisoning of all the fish in the sea, not just some piece of unsightly stuff on the beach, that's going to get a little easier. And I think, yeah, so much for the partially good news. Not so good news on the plastic, but I wish I had a better spin on that. Thank you very much.
So Chris, may we pass to you? This is a man who's got huge passion for conservation, and you will see it firsthand.
Thank you, Tom. As Tom mentioned, I'm a professor at George Mason University, and I'm also very involved with the Society for Conservation Biology. And as a gratuitous plug, I'd just like to mention that our International Marine Conservation Congress is in August in Scotland this year. We have sponsorship from whiskey distilleries. So if you want to be at the largest academic gathering of marine conservationists, it's in August in Glasgow.
Drunk conservationists, never a pretty sight.
So I'd like to start off with a quote from Professor Albus Dumbledore. There comes a time when you must choose between what is easy and what is right. And arguably, marine conservation is very, very right, but marine conservation is definitely not easy. It's expensive and there are myriad issues. As Andreas pointed out, there are a lot of problems with the oceans, and I would argue that the oceans today are in crisis. Issues with climate change and ocean acidification, and quite frankly, ocean acidification is, the potential for that is one that fills me with horror. What happens if calcareous phytoplankton start disappearing because of acidification? They're basically the cornfields of the ocean on which so many ecosystems depend, and if they start going, that will have major knock-on effects. We have a variety of pollutants, heavy metals, organochlorine contaminants. Just last week, I was interviewed by a reporter about the mass die-off of dolphins in the southeast, which is now being linked to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And so there's a variety of contaminants and chemicals related to the oil industry that we don't really understand. Andreas mentioned marine trash, which is a ubiquitous problem. I saw plastic bags in Antarctica beginning of last year. In amongst penguins, penguins had trash in their nests in Antarctica. The problems of ghost fishing, problems of overfishing, new problems such as underwater noise and the impact on marine life, not just whales and dolphins, which it causes strandings in, but we're now finding out it has impacts on other species as well, including fish. And nutrient pollution and dead zones that are associated. There are many issues affecting the oceans, but at the same time, we have a chronic lack of understanding of the oceans, and in fact science in general, in the general public. A survey just recently pointed out that about half of the US public doesn't believe in anthropogenic influence in climate change. 1 in 5 people thinks the sun revolves around the earth. We did a survey of university students. Only 1 in 20 could tell you the most endangered whale species in the US. And these are university students, some of which had done biology courses. Surveys on biodiversity as well, whether or not people understand that. People seem to think they understand what biodiversity is, but they really, really don't care that much about it. So many of these issues, such as pollution, such as climate change, we have known about for decades, but the public hasn't really come behind it. And certainly the policymakers haven't got behind marine conservation. And I would argue that one of the problems is that a lot of marine scientists are happy to stay in their ivory towers and not come out and communicate with the public. And it really, really needs to be done. So many scientists think that advocating for marine conservation, or even telling people about their science, getting their scientific papers into the hands of policymakers or aides, is somehow sullying themselves. They're being dirty by advocating. And we really, really need to do this, particularly at a time when Congress, scientists are outnumbered 10 to 1 by lawyers and by accountants. And even some of those scientists, for example, one rather infamous one in the Committee for Science and Technology, doesn't believe in evolution and doesn't believe in climate change. So how are we going to convince policymakers that the marine environment and the oceans are important? This morning I was in an NGO, and I was rather disillusioned when I heard going on in the background basically a bunch of NGOs infighting about who was going to lead a particular campaign and squabbling over funding and media profiles. If you want to win a battle, you have your infantry, you have your cavalry, you have your artillery, and they all have different roles and different strengths. And by working together in a coordinated fashion, using those strengths and recognizing the weaknesses, then you can win the battle. But what many NGOs and agencies and scientists are doing is they all want to lead the charge, or they're not working together. The infantry is working independently from the cavalry, much to the detriment of marine conservation. So I argue that we need to be somewhat more strategic, that the scientists need to be encouraged to come out of the ivory towers, to work with the NGOs and to work with the agencies to try and make the public care about marine conservation, whether it be the importance of the ocean as a source of food and food security, or whether it's just because it's the home of whales and dolphins and people love whales and dolphins. We really need to do that. And if we can do that, if we can make the public care about the oceans, then that translates into votes. And then the policymakers will start caring about the oceans. Now, one of our weapons in our arsenal, arguably, is something as simple as social media. Now, more and more NGOs and scientists are using social media, but it has been responsible for example, regime changes in other parts of the world. But we really need to be engaging this, getting science and information into the hands of the public. I don't know how many of you have heard of a documentary called Blackfish. So most of you are nodding your head. So Blackfish has trended, I think, 6 times at least on Twitter. More than 90 million people have watched this documentary, which for a documentary is absolutely astounding. And it's actually led to some quite significant policy actions. Over in Europe, the Sea Life Centres, Merlin Entertainment. Merlin Entertainment actually is a cousin company to SeaWorld. They're both owned by Blackstone Holdings. But Merlin Entertainment has said that they are going to basically release all the captive cetaceans, whales and dolphins in their facilities. And they are developing open water sea pen sanctuaries to move these animals into for basically for the rest of their lives. They are not having animals in captivity anymore. India has banned cetaceans in captivity. Romania at the moment is discussing a law whether or not to give dolphins the same legal status as humans, of all things. A huge tirade over the Taiji drive hunts, if you've heard about those, made first popular with the movie The Cove, and now really taking Twitter by force. So such the state that Caroline Kennedy was tweeting about it, and that tweet ran the world and led to various state departments in various different countries backing her statements up. So that was all because of communication and social media, and we should be really doing more of that in the marine conservation environment. People care about things like whales and dolphins, so let's use that. So just to finish off, as I said, the oceans need more public concern. We need to get the policy makers to realize that people care about the oceans. We need oceans to be up there in the list with transport and health and issues such as that, not somewhere tucked away down in rank 20 environmental issues, including the oceans. So just to finish off with another quote, that will be difficult. It will take a lot of time. It will take a lot of effort. It will take a lot of man hours. But to quote Yoda, do or do not. There is no try. And arguably with the oceans, there is such a problem. We really have to do something very fast, because within 100 years, the world will be a very different place and potentially a very unpleasant place if we don't.
So I'm going to open it up in a couple minutes for questions. But I'd like to start off with one for each. So we look to the oceans. This is for Andreas. We look to the oceans for fish and a healthy diet, right? And yet we've been putting a lot of pressure on the fisheries. you've done some really interesting thinking about the potential of aquaculture in all of this. Could you just give us a few of your thoughts on that?
Aquaculture is on the right path, right? The thing about aquaculture is it has some localized impact, and which are not so great, but in the grand scheme of things, they are probably not the largest problem that oceans face. The problem with aquaculture is that you have to kill fish to feed fish. But if you now look at the sort of the trends over time, the degree of animal protein that is now in the feed, for many of the species, this is continuously going down, right? Going down to the place now where it's actually, from a point of view of sort of life cycle or energetic management of the stocks, it's probably better for a lot of the stocks that they are farmed rather than wild caught. What gets a little trickier, though, is to say, all right, so we were solving the biological problems. And so we're going to raise a whole lot of fish, and we're going to replace meat with that, right? Which is wonderful, because fish is vastly more effective or efficient from a CO2 point of view than, for example, beef, right? Like 10 times. And so we may actually have a partial solution to climate change by simply switching from beef to fish. That doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work, here's what happens, right? So you make a bunch more fish through your aquaculture. And so you have more supply. And fundamental economics is that the price then goes down, right? And so you're creating extra income. So here's the thing. Most people, and that's true whether you're South African or American or Chinese, most people have a food budget. And if they save $1, that dollar is spent within that food budget, number one. And number two, they have a portfolio theory of buying, or approach to buying protein. They buy a little bit of fish, they buy a little bit of chicken, they buy a little bit of beef, right? And as you get wealthier, and if you go out the middle class, you typically move from fish to chicken to beef. So if you get a bunch more fish, that is a bunch cheaper, and you create a bunch of income, that income is spent on beef, meat. So you're basically getting exactly the reverse effect that you were hoping for, right? So one has to be careful with these sort of wonderful, easy substitution theories. Often economics throws a wrench into that, right? But as a way of course, that's not universally true, that's the global picture, as a way of locally feeding people, of providing food securities in places in the world that really need it. We're basically on the right, technologically, biologically, we're on the right track with aquaculture, I think. It's just not going to be the big solution to climate change and food security for the world. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Organizing these conferences for marine conservationists, one of the biggest problems we have is actually working out what food to give them. Because no matter what we do, someone says, oh, that's wrong. You can't have that tilapia. Because...
How about tilapia?
Well, tilapia is one of the ones we've come down with, and some catfish and shellfish, sustainably farmed shellfish. But really, it becomes very, very difficult. So most of the meetings, we just say, right, no seafood. Because there are so many issues, even with certain types of aquaculture. There may, as you said, be local problems related to aquaculture. And there have been some irresponsible aquaculture companies. But then again, on the other side, I have been very enthused. As you can tell from the accent, I'm British, but whenever I visit there, the big drive for sustainable and environmentally foods. And that's kind of a snobbery factor. So I think the Brits, as they get more money, they actually go more and more sustainable and to have the best Jamie Oliver food that they can get. So instead of turning to beef, they turn to more environmentally food. And that was quite encouraging to see that.
So, and that's what our doctors have been telling us to do anyway, right? So my question for Chris, one aspect of the changing ocean environment that we have not touched on is sea level rise. And, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, there's always a big sort of fuss over what the rate is going to be over the next 50 years or so, or whatever it may be, when in fact we know from the history of the planet what the end point will be. We don't know how long it will take to get there, but we know, that the last time the Earth was 2 degrees warmer, that the oceans were at least 4 to 6 meters higher, and in fact, probably even higher than that, according to something I ran across recently. So this is going to create a series of challenges for the terrestrial system, but it will also create some biological challenges. And I wonder what thoughts you have about that, Chris.
Oh, gosh. Well, to begin with sea level rise, I actually come from a place called Somerset, which, if any of you have been following what's going on in the UK at the moment, a lot of that county is currently underwater. In fact, the house I grew up in my tweens is underwater. That whole area is flooded by large amounts of rain, or in fact by seawater, because coastal defences have been overrun in some locations. So now the UK is taking sea level rise more seriously, even though the scientists have been telling them, in fact, over 10 years ago, as I was leaving the UK, we got a leaflet through our door talking about climate change and what sea level rise could mean to our coastal communities, but nothing was done because of political lack of will, basically. So certainly coming from that side of the Atlantic, where we're seeing extreme amounts of rain falling, we're seeing massive amounts of flooding, exacerbated by poor planning, I have to say, putting houses in floodplains and so on. But the potential impacts there are now starting to be realized in some areas, if not in the US. This morning I looked at a computer program called Drown Your Town, which I highly recommend looking for on the internet. You can actually pick your city and then raise sea level. And we did that for Louisiana this morning. Basically, Louisiana ceases to exist in 5 meters of sea level rise. So the potential impacts on humans alone could be quite major in terms of sea level rise. Of course, that will lead to changing coastal habitats. That could lead to a lot of, as sea levels start to rise, I can imagine that will lead to a lot of construction around the coasts, which will lead to noise, which will lead to pollution. So even in the interim, it's going to lead to a lot of coastal habitat change, which could affect many species. The exact impact on marine life is really quite hard to gauge. There are many modeling exercises going on trying to work out thermal tolerances of fish species, for example, or marine mammal species, and where they are likely to go, what's going to happen to the habitat as temperatures rise. One example, a white-beaked dolphin, which is very common in northern Europe. It's a cold water species, but models estimate within about 50 years its habitat will completely be gone. Likely it would be threatened with extinction long before then, though, because as it gets pushed further and further north, it gets into areas which is not its habitat. So the exact impact on marine species is really uncertain. People are trying to look at it, but one of my big concerns would be, what's the impact of climate change forcing species out of their normal habitats, perhaps into marginal habitats where they're going to have to adapt in areas with prey species that they're no longer used to, being exposed to diseases they haven't been exposed to before, in a background of noise pollution, in a background of chemical pollution, and in a background of destruction of the seabed. It's another major stressor. So I think climate change is likely to combine with other problems in the oceans just to exacerbate the situation in the short term, let alone the long-term impacts of sea level rise and coastal areas being flooded.
Great. So on the Isle, And please identify yourself.
Yeah, Leon Kalankowitz. Hey, Ed. Leon Kalankowitz. I'm a wildlife biologist, population activist, and work for a small environmental consulting firm. I've done a lot of work as a consulting biologist to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for national wildlife refuges from the Caribbean to Alaska. One in particular, Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge in the so-called Low Country region of South Carolina, has these wonderful bottomland hardwood forests that are maybe a meter above sea level. The service has been doing analyses called SLAM analyses, sea level rise and effects on coastal habitats. Within a century, those will all be gone and replaced with open water or marsh. Nobody really knows, but those magnificent forests, which have been there essentially since time immemorial, will no longer be. Now, I had two questions for both of you, unrelated to that, but I wanted to get your take on these estimates I've been reading for some years. The estimate, first of all, or the claim, but on the part of qualified fisheries biologists, that 90% of the large organisms, you know, the tuna, the salmon, the predators have been wiped out, and then only 10% are left. So, and then the second, what about the claim, I think it's out of Dalhousie University up in Nova Scotia, that primary productivity has plummeted over the past century? Are you familiar with that claim as well?
I'll take the first, you'll take the second. Sharks are down 90%. That is true. Predators are down more than prey. That has to do with the productivity inherent to predators, right? I mean, it's fascinating. We think of the food chain always as this, right? The predators are the top, the prey. But if you look at a pristine reef, right, it's actually the other way around. There's more biomass of predators in the water than there is of prey. And the reason that is because a shark lives for 23 years and has 1 or 2 pups a year, right? So it's very stable up there. And its prey, it lays 300,000 eggs every 2 weeks and lives for 2 months, right? And the entire system has evolved precisely and very beautifully calibrated to no other end, right, than to produce just enough food through unbelievable productivity down here to feed that biomass down there, right? It's like basically I weigh 190 pounds, but I don't have 190 pounds of stuff in my refrigerator, right? It replenishes. It's basically the same thing. What has happened is, yes, we have a disproportionate amount of predators been taken, but you know, there's a lot of populations that are still in pretty good shape. Skipjack, which is, you know, there's probably 7 or 8 million tons of skipjack in the water at any one time, and those are doing pretty well. And there's all kinds of others. It's that claim is basically true only for sharks.
Well, the primary productivity question, I'm not sure about the paper you specifically mentioned.
Boris Worm.
Was it Boris Worm?
Yeah.
I was going to say, but I could probably guess who's done it. I mean, there are some papers that do come out that make predictions and claims based on modeling, which sometimes, as we get closer and closer to the dates, look less and less like the truth. So I would always have a little bit of caution when you see great big, sort of all-inclusive modeling models and predictions. But
based on that, where you put the disc under the water.
Cygnus. But certainly there are several studies which have looked at specific areas and regions that have seen decreases in productivity or very important prey species. And I'm more aware of impacts in the Antarctica with krill stocks, for example, and in North Atlantic, because that's where I work. But certainly they have seen big decreases in keystone prey species in those regions.
So just elaborate a little bit more on the krill picture in the Antarctic.
Well, there are a lot of issues affecting krill in Antarctica. One with just the shells disappearing, which is one of the areas where the krill go underneath during the winter. So there's been a big change in distribution of krill. Sometimes they see big groups of krill still, but in some areas the productivity and the levels of krill are just substantially reduced from what they were historically, and then that's being reflected in whale and dolphin distributions. One of my tasks every year is to produce it's called SOCCA, the State of the Cetacean Environment Report, and we pull together information on habitat and climate issues, and we have a running column on issues related to productivity, particularly in the polar regions where there are changes and shifts in prey species and productivity. And that, as I said, that's one of my big causes of concern with ocean acidification as well, how that's going to affect things.
These big papers that talk about, the impoverishment of the ecosystem in all of the ocean, or we're going to run out of fish in 40 or 50 years, and all of that, I want to underline that I would be very cautious with that.
Yeah,
it's too complex a system.
I'd urge fellow scientists that produce these papers that it's actually detrimental, because if you have a big, high-profile paper like that says that fish are going to be gone by 2050, when we get to 2038 and there's still lots of fish in the ocean, it's going to make it hard for the rest of us to convince the policymakers what we're saying is correct.
So I would just insert an editorial remark at this point, which is there's a really important difference between projections and predictions. And projections are deliberately made to hope to change human behavior and make sure that the projection doesn't turn out to have been a prediction. But on the aisle back there, yes, please.
Hello, my name is Martin Apple, and I'm associated with the Council of Scientific Society Presidents. So my question really comes down to the following. Instead of bringing more bad news to the world, which tends to make people believe that there's nothing they can do, why not figure out what strategies we can unified do that will in fact succeed? Your question of we should try and educate a policymaker, to me, is the wrong solution. We should be the policymakers. We should run for those offices until enough of us get elected to do that. We should teach our children so that millions a year all through the world are graduating knowing these kinds of information and understand it well. I think a much more far-reaching, overreaching, but unified strategic approach can make a world movement that would actually succeed, as opposed to having all the fragmented people arguing and going in their different directions. So I'm making a proposal to you and asking you what you think of that.
I definitely agree. A very strategic approach is the way to go forward, with people working together. In terms of people have concerns running for Congress to be policymakers, as a Brit, it's much easier to do in somewhere like the UK. In fact, I have a yearning to jump into politics in the UK sometime, maybe, when I retire. But there it's much easier, because you don't need to be a millionaire or billionaire in order to run for election, and the election cycle is 2 weeks. In the US, where increasingly it's the amount of money that you have and the amount of funding that you have that leads to whether or not you're going to be elected, particularly in terms of super PACs and so on. That becomes a much bigger problematic issue. I would say if you are going to become a policymaker, I encourage a lot of my students to join places like NOAA and Fish and Wildlife, to join the agencies, so that they can work with the agencies to make sure that there's good scientific management decisions being made and the right decisions are being made, or local politics. And quite often state politics can have a big impact, particularly if you're, for example, in California and the coastal states, which can have major impacts.
I do want to say, to support you, right now we have the best fisheries management law in the world, right? Well, with Australia. We're restoring all of our stocks. We have one of the best protected area systems in the world in California. We're funneling billions of dollars towards restoring the Gulf. Well, it took a gusher to do that, but we have incredibly good people working at NOAA and very, very deep expertise there. It's not like this is a desert, right? So The second piece I wanted to say, I'm sorry, but did anybody here read Nate Silver's Signal and Noise? It's a great book. He makes the point there that whenever in history you've had a new technology which led to new information overload, like a wave of new information washing over you, starting with Gutenberg, everybody always hoped that it would bring people together. And in fact, what happened is that it's always led to violent new sectarianism, because people get very scared of all that information, and they retreat into the safety of the foxholes of their pre-existing biases, and they only pluck the bits out of that wave, right? That they need to basically thicken the walls of their foxhole, and that's exactly what we're seeing. So, just the old battle cry of sounding the clarion call and giving people more information about how bad it all really is, and all we need to do is get that information out there, and all will be well. That's probably exactly wrong. Right, so what we need to do instead is get people out of their foxholes and actually come with some solutions. So that's where I wanted to, my long way of agreeing with you on leading with solutions and hope, rather than simply more information about the million ways that things are going south.
Chris?
I just was reminded about one of my students I had once upon a time. She did a survey looking at public attitudes and awareness of whale and dolphin conservation issues, and tacked onto the end of her questionnaire, she went around the various cities and towns in Scotland, tacked onto the end of her questionnaire was, would you be more likely to vote for a politician if they supported a whale and dolphin act? Now, up until that time, there had been no mention of whales and dolphins in any political campaigning material. In fact, not even really talking about the oceans apart from fisheries and supporting fishermen. She produced her paper, she did a summary. She got a friend to leave piles of this summary in the Scottish Parliament, and also got a friendly MSP to pass it around. The very next election, which is about 6 months later, every single political party specifically mentioned whale and dolphin conservation in their manifestos. And we did actually, as a knock-on effect, end up getting marine protected areas having a higher profile, and also marine animals in their impacts in terms of tourism and the amount they bring into the economy. So little things like that can have an impact. As I said, if you get to what the policymaker cares about, then sometimes you can influence them.
Great. So I'm going to take, there are about three over here. So the gentleman, yes, please.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Rafael Olivieri. I'm a consultant. And I'm just going to put a small commercial plug for Policy and Science. I'm a former AAAS Science and Policy Fellowship. Mm-hmm. And I really encourage, if anyone over here is has a grad student or is in the academic world and wants to influence policy, look for the AAAS Science Policy Fellowship, because it's one of the best programs to bring people in science out of the ivory tower into policy. Mm-hmm. And it's a great program. I highly recommend it. It's just take this opportunity.
Oh, and also programs
so
like Nous Fellowships, Smith Fellows. There's a lot of really, really good programs out there that allow people to make that cross into science and policy.
Yeah, very, really important point. So right in front, yes. Yeah.
Hi, Marcia Johnston. I'm a journalist. I hope you don't mind. I was going to ask Andreas if he could just reiterate those numbers about the plastic. You ground it up and you found 100,000? I mean, just
please don't quote me. It was somewhere around 50 to 100,000 is what we can find, right?
Tons
in
the water after you ground. After, maybe I can talk to you after. Maybe I should just talk to you after. Sorry.
Great. And on the aisle, sir. Yes.
Yes, my name's Maxwell Meyer. I work for USDA, but I also wear many hats. I'm an aquaculture program specialist with USDA. I'm a trained nutritionist and biochemist, but I also am the USDA representative on the Interagency Working Group on Ocean Acidification. I'm on the Biomass R&D board for the Working Group on Algae, and I'm currently on a team that's working on developing organic standards for aquatic species. I don't know if the paradigm you had talking about cheap fish automatically equates to shift in consumer choices. I don't think Japan has done that. They are certainly.
We modeled it for. We ran the economic models for China, South Africa, and the United States. So maybe Japan is in every aspect when it comes to seafood a strange place. So that might very well be an outlier. Yes.
Great. So, yes?
Marvin Ott, the Wilson Center. It was really for Andres, I guess, primarily. You made a reference to the Gulf of Maine, having some, house on the Gulf and all that. I'm interested in the specific issue, and you might tease it out to draw a larger lesson. The ground fishery in the Gulf of Maine. You talk to old timers that look at the water right in front of our house, and they said there used to be flounder out there. You could go out in an open boat 30 feet from the shore with a spear, and you could find dinner. There hasn't been a flounder in those waters in 30, 40 years, as far as I know. What's happened? But yet there's been various efforts to restore that fishery. And it's obviously Georges Bank is a much bigger deal than the flounders off my shore. But can you talk about the whole problem of ground fisheries, their disappearance, and why, as I gather, we've been unsuccessful in restoring them so far?
It's a really interesting thing, and I think I'm going to also pass it over to you. Generally, all over the world, the beautiful thing with fisheries is that when you stop fishing, they tend to recover, right? And there's only one thing that puts a lot of salt in that soup, and that's the ground fish in the Gulf of Maine, right? And we really haven't figured out. We have stopped fishing, Georges Bank as well, and the recovery has been much less. And so I have heard a number of theories. One of them is climate change related, which is, for example, that the epicenter of cod has always been up in Labrador, and now as things are heating up, it's basically doing this, right? So the peripheral populations are moving towards the center, and then you overlay that with overfishing. That's what's going on. Other theories are, of course, that there's a lot of pieces of in fish life cycle that have to do with what we call the benthic environment, the ground, right? And that we've had a regime shift there with lobsters, which are now hyperabundant, and that something fundamentally has changed there, that the juvenile life stages, they cannot make it across anymore. But do you have a favorite theory of why the groundfish are not coming back?
Not really about the groundfish. I definitely agree with you. The issues such as climate change combined with overfishing are issues. There's also things related to, have you heard of the term the alley effect, which impacts very, very small populations? And that's related to the behavior of animals. For example, it becomes much harder to find a mate. It becomes much harder to avoid predators if you're in smaller and smaller numbers. And so, to some extent, the alley effect may be affecting some fish stocks, which are just getting to critically small numbers, and so it becomes much harder for them to then recover because they just don't have defense or awareness of predators because they're in smaller numbers and so on. So, better understanding of the biology, the natural history, and the ecology of some exploited fish species, I think, will help us to understand why some species are impacted quite the way that they do.
There's one common misperception, right, which is about commercial fishing. Most people think that the way commercial fishing works is you have a historical level of fish, right, 100% pristine biomass, and then you fish that down 20 or 30%, and then you let it recover, and that's what you do. That's not what you do, right? Because the recovery at the top of that range is pretty slow. The ecosystem takes its time to just slowly recover. You're at the flat end of the diminishing return curve. Instead, what you do is you really stress the system. And it used to be that we would fish down to about 50% of what the original biomass is, and let it come back to 70, and we would dance that dance, and that was called maximum sustainable yield. Today, we often go to 40, 35, 30%, and let it recover back down to 50. That point, you're starting to really play with fire because, of course, there's natural variations. There's a stochasticity to the stocks that is basically natural, right? And we've had many crashes where we're doing perfectly, technically okay, maximum sustainable yield fishing, but in fact, you put one more thing, one more stress on, and the thing goes south, right? And then you get into situations that you cannot recover from, and especially in New England, that happened a lot, right?
So it's not unique to marine systems either. I mean, this sort of propensity of our species to manage whatever it is up to sort of the asymptote, ignoring the reality that sooner or later some other factor is going to come along and perturb that. So Chris, and then we'll go to the patient gentleman in the second row.
Just sort of catch on something that was kind of mentioned. There is a sort of shifting baseline or moving goalpost of what the marine environment should look like. And increasingly there are studies showing photos, for example, of big catches in Florida when you had enormous fish 50 years ago, and now a big catch is like this. That's a sort of pervasive problem with the marine environment. Kind of degraded is the new pristine. People, when they talk about recovering marine ecosystems, they're recovering it back to a level which is probably already very, very degraded after several hundred years of exploitation and damage. And so that is something to consider.
Great. Finally.
I'm Dr. Whitten. I'm a medical doctor.
Mike?
Okay. I'm Dr. Whitten, Stanley Whitten. I'm a medical doctor and a PhD and an environmentalist, by the way. About 10 years ago, I developed a government program called NBIC, the National Biosurveillance Integration Center, using the NBIS, the National Biosurveillance Interagency System, that fused all of the information up and down the mall here, worldwide, every day, second by second, as it was being generated about human health, animal health, the environmental conditions, the chemical conditions in that environment, and came out with a basic common operating picture of what the world was occurring. Much like when a doctor sees a patient, he knows what the vital signs are, and he knows when those vital signs become symptomatic of a disease, based on the models and the holistic approach. As I've been listening to this conversation today, you've been giving a lot of very good anecdotal information, but it needs that fusion piece that is holistic and understanding the symptomatic change and vital signs that are warnings and indications, both not just in the oceans, but within the entire global world of threats.
That's what I was trying to get to, and obviously I didn't do it very eloquently. When we were talking about this triangle, right? The ocean is an unfathomably complex system. We cannot deterministically manage it. We need to figure out a way to manage it to a very clever set of indicators that are indicative of the overall health, right? And that's a making things simple like that is the most difficult thing to do. I mean, finding the reliable indicators and that on qualities such as resilience, robustness, integrity, health, you will find that it's very hard to do for a body. It's even harder to do for a system like an ocean with all of its subsystems and its biochemical madness with all of the stressors that are now coming in. But we got to do that. And there are various people, if you now look at who's working on that and the papers that are coming out, what gives me hope is that There's an incredible amount of effort going into that, number one. Number two, observation systems are getting so cheap. What was $1 million buoy is now a $1,000 tennis ball. The remote sensing is incredibly good. The costs of the data is going way down. The big data, our crunching ability is going up. So our ability to actually get some analytical insight into that complex problem is going up. So I'm confident that we're going to get there. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, I see a lot of encouraging work on the ocean health indices that have been done recently. But the ocean is a very, very complex place. And like the atmosphere is a very complex place. And the way that we can predict the weather for possibly maybe a day or two, although we still get it wrong in DC, that took a lot of computing power and a lot of scientists. And really the same sort of resources are not being put into conservation, and certainly not being put into marine conservation, which is, in terms of conservation funding, is very much on the sort of kiddies table as far as conservation funding is going, and it's a lot more expensive. There is a technology with satellites, imagery and sensors and so on, where we can get a lot of this information, but there's also information that we need that is a lot more difficult to get and a lot more expensive to get. And I guess basically it comes down to more and more resources and more time and energy being put into developing this. But I don't see why it isn't, and there's some encouraging work being done.
I had a fisherman once tell me, I don't go out dressed based on 2 years ago weather report. Why am I fishing on a 2 year ago set of stock assessments, right? Why can't we have real time stock assessments? Well, the problem with that is one of observational complexity, but the other problem with that is that the feedback cycles in fisheries are sometimes very slow, right? You can be totally overfishing a fishery and you will not know it by the economics of your results. And the reason is that fish school, right? And you may be coming home with the last, you may have just caught the last school and your boat is brimming full, right? And you're telling your spouse, I don't know what those greenies are talking about. There's plenty of fish in the sea. Well, you just wiped out the last school. So the feedback cycles are tricky in fishing. I was giving some testimony the other day, and this was, believe it or not, in the science committee. And a certain congressman says, you mean to tell me that I should believe the scientists? He said it with a accent, and my German accent and Southern accents don't go together. But he said, Mr. Merkel, you need to tell me that I can see with my God-given eyes that there's fish on the dock, and I should believe the scientists when they tell me that there isn't any. And we had to say there's zero predictive power in the fish on the dock, zero. Right, and that's a hard causal chain or lack thereof for a lot of people to sort of grasp.
That's great. So they're going to take a couple in the back and then one in the middle and then come down to the forward. So yes, please.
Hello. My name is Eddie Gonzalez, and I work at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, working on the program that Raphael mentioned. But I'm also here because I volunteer with a community organization that's recruiting urban youth, particularly, to get into marine education and marine science. And one of the pieces that I struggle with is in listening to these kinds of presentations, a lot of the piece that's missing is the so what when it relates to the general public. And if that's the space that I'm working in, my question to you is, do you feel that the marine conservation community has done a good job distilling down a set of talking points that are translatable to the general public? And how much of that is impacting our ability to move this conversation forward?
I would argue that the marine community hasn't really, but there is progress. Some of the big advocates for science communication are people like Randy Olson, the guys who are working in Compass, and they developed, for example, the Compass guys developed what's called a message box. You have your science issue, and in that, your science issue, you basically have to put it in terms of why. Why does this matter to me? So what are my benefits? How does this affect me? How does this affect my kids? So I think there is a growing awareness of this, and certainly my students in the audience will be able to tell you that I emphasize that in classes too. So I think it's getting there. Actually, I think the marine conservation community in some ways is further ahead of some of the terrestrial conservation communities in terms of realizing the importance for communication of science and communication of ocean issues. But yeah, historically, they haven't done a great job. And I think that's why so many science communicators are arising in the marine conservation community. They recognize there's a big gap and there's a big problem that needs to be addressed.
That's great. So yes, please, right in the middle. Whoops.
Hi, thanks. My name is
Then
Mark.
it goes to you.
Great. So my name is Mark Gibson. I'm a program officer with World Wildlife Fund working in fisheries. And so I actually want to pose an alternative narrative to the problem in fisheries and see what you think. And this is a little unusual because I don't normally get to do this, but I'm actually finishing at World Wildlife Fund next week, and I'm off to do this for PhD work. So I have a little more freedom right now. So in my view, you know, I've been listening to this, and I hear some issues. One, NGOs aren't getting their act together, that there's infighting over funding. Another issue is that policymakers aren't passing the right rules. Another is academia is not getting out to the field enough. But in my experience, I travel all around Latin America doing field projects, and I would say it's none of that. I would say in academia, we engage a lot on natural science. I'm bringing consultants all the time for our projects. For policy, we know a lot of times what the rules should be because we have good science now. Public, in fact, I would say the issue there is a lot of misinformation. And you guys touched on some of this issue of no fish left in the sea by 2050 is still floating around, this issue of, you know, most of the big fish gone, that's still floating around. I would actually challenge this, and I would say the issues are, in my mind, the two biggest problems to getting fisheries management right would be, first, funding, that we have a failure in most countries of the world to charge for resource use, that this is something we do in most natural resources arenas, minerals, even forestry, but in fisheries, for the most part, it's a subsidy, that management from the government is a subsidy. And so if you don't close that loop and the resource user isn't paying anything for it, that you don't have much money to go around to managing it. That's one. I would say the other is what we're starting to get into with fisheries and even wildlife. You hear all about now wildlife crime. So in fisheries, I would say we have a lot of rules. We just don't know how to implement them. A conservative estimate, Agnew et al. In 2009, is that a quarter of all fish, conservative estimate, a quarter of all the fish taken from the oceans is taken illegally. So either the rules aren't right or we're not implementing them right. So I would say that the second problem is that we're no longer asking the right questions. I see a lot of focus on what are the problems with the oceans, in particular fisheries, but not the question, what works. We hear a lot of debate on this, MSC certification, for example, but there's no real agreement in the environmental community if MSC or eco certification works. World Wildlife Fund, for example, is very pro, and I would agree with that. I think the science is good, but you don't see agreement in the environmental community. Same thing, rights-based management. You don't see agreement in the environmental community. You see Conservation International trying some innovative things with conditional cash transfers, for example, but very little study and agreement. I wonder if maybe the question now is the time that we actually see the environmental community start advocating for resource users to pay for some of their management, one, and two, to actually try what we're seeing now in the international development scene, to do randomized controlled studies of interventions in fisheries, and so that we actually have some independent analysis that it's above the fray in the environmental community, so we don't think the science is tainted, to actually say what works and what doesn't. So that's just an alternative narrative. I am putting my money where my mouth is, so this is what I'm going to be trying to do some of my PhD work. So, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, so thank you.
Great, and if you would pass it forward 2 rows. There we are. Please.
Thank you. I'd agree and disagree with you. certainly the real cost of fisheries, I think, is a very, very important one. So many fisheries are hugely subsidized, don't factor into the environmental costs of the fisheries. We recently did a kind of a brainstorming exercise about what the big research questions were for the oceans and marine conservation, and that was exactly one of them that people very, very strongly about issues about subsidies. What's a better method than subsidies? How do we calculate the real cost of fisheries? And I also agree there's a lot of paper tigers out there, a lot of marine protected areas which are just lines on a map with absolutely no enforcement. There are some great treaties out there which, when they were written, fantastic treaties, which basically haven't been implemented, either because of lack of resource or lack of political will. The Spore Protocol is a prime example of that. I've got a student at the moment who's looking in to try and find out what impact that actually has. A couple of places it has, but a lot of areas, agency people don't even know what's in it. So enforcement of the laws, resources to make sure the laws work, is definitely the foundation. You need that foundation underneath a law. You need enforcement, you need will from policymakers, from the agencies, and also from the general public in the area where an MPA is, in order for it to work. In terms of academics in South America, I actually do a lot of work in Latin America. I worked in Dominican Republic, Panama, Ecuador, a variety of places. And one of the projects we're working on at the moment, the local community has had lots of scientists come in. To help them. There's a big scientific station in that actual community, but they do feel the scientists don't actually come out and engage with the community. It's them and us. They see people come in to help them, but then as soon as their funding goes, they go away and they're back to where they were, and often things have got worse because they're so frustrated. They had all their hopes up, and then the next person comes in and they're much more resistant to actually get involved with the scientists because they've seen this before, they've been told this before, and nothing's really happened. So, and in other areas I've seen where scientists have come into communities, worked with the local people, and then left, basically taking the data with them and not giving the data to the local communities who really, really need it. So they end up having to repeat exactly the same projects on shoestring budgets without the training. And that has been a big problem in some areas. The Society of Conservation Biology actually has in their professional ethical guidelines language to try and stop that sort of thing happening, that you have an obligation to work and help with the communities that the scientists are working in. But a lot of people still don't. And a lot of funding agencies think in the 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, we will pay this and then it will be done, and magically it will be self-sustaining. And very often these projects need long-term funding, 10 years or more, and perhaps even permanent funding until they really, really get on their feet. And that's really needs a sort of paradigm shift in funding for the big agencies, I think. We need to get away from this short-term, throw a bunch of money at it and we will fix the problem. And also helping the local communities to have the training and the resources and expertise to do those jobs themselves.
You've been very patient, so.
Hello. My name is Chen Ding. I'm from Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. We are having some funding programs with the individual journalists that they are doing the ocean health reporting projects. My question is, I originally from China, that you two both talked about a lot of the facts and numbers. I think they are mostly related to with the American and with the developed countries. So I want to ask you two about the culture in Asia, that most of the population, increasing a lot in the next 20 years. And the eating habit, their customer behavior, there, they just more likely to put money on the seafood and all those things, the fish and things, when they are getting wealthier. So what do you guys think the opinion on that? Quite obviously, it's different with the Western countries.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are different. You're going to have, in Asia alone, 1.5 billion people entering the middle class, almost 2, I think, in the next 25 years. And all these people are going to move up the protein chain, right? And they're going to go from plant-based protein to low trophic level fish, i.e. anchovies, and then they're going to move to meats, and then they're going to go to high trophic level fish and sushi and so on, right? And it's simply, if you, from every perspective, if you do the math on that, especially the carbon math, it's devastating. And food is 7 or 8 gigatons a year. It's devastating. It's going to get much worse for that. So that all cannot happen, right? But these people want to have the same life that I enjoy. So what are we going to do about that? It's not like the ocean is going to yield any more in Asia than it is now. The stocks are mostly overfished already. Information from China is not all that easy to get, but we know from various sources that the amount of overfishing is huge, and that the Chinese fleet has to go further and further out, right? Data point number 3: our methods won't work, right? American methods, Magnuson-Stevens Act, has to do with single species fisheries, pollock, cod, lobster. It doesn't work for fisheries that go out and catch 20 or 30 in the same nets. So where all that is adding up for me in terms of developing country fisheries is 2 things, right? Some reduction of capacity is going to be inevitable and will probably happen because it's much more profitable. But secondly, we're going to have to rethink fishing completely. There was a study done which I find so interesting, and it was about not China, but it was about Lake Tanganyika. And on one side of Lake Tanganyika you have Tanzania, and on the other one you have Congo. And Tanzania has been crawling with Norwegian aid workers for the last 20 years, and they have taught the locals how to fish. And they've done their stock assessments, and they imposed quotas, and they did everything right, and so on and so forth. On the Congo side, helter-skelter, right? Those guys put nets in the water that had mesh sizes the size of pantyhose, right? I mean, just everything in the water they caught. But they kept it, from slime to prime, they kept it all. And they sold it because they're very poor and they could use it all, right? So 20 years later, they did an ecological assessment of the lake, and they find that the Congo side is actually in much better shape. Why? Because if you remember the pyramid, if you apply a perfectly random effort to this pyramid, statistically, you're going to catch much less up the top and much more down the bottom. The bottom is vastly more productive than the top, right? So a perfectly random fishing effort, right, is probably not all that bad. We have been taught to think of it as horrible. My God, they're strip mining the ocean. Maybe we have to rethink some of these fundamental assumptions. I'm not saying that this can be transferred to the open ocean. Fishermen can't sell a lot of slime. They have been they've been taught for generations to be very selective. All of our management systems are about selectivity, right? But to come back to China and to Asia and to these sort of multi-species fisheries with relentless pressure, we're not going to fix that by applying these incredibly differentiated management systems. It's just not going to work. The governance structure, the will, the thrill, the skill, nothing is there to do that. But maybe we can come up with some simplifications, and maybe it's around randomness and selectivity and overall effort and some combination thereof, right? Where we can at least restore some measure of integrity to that triangle. And that's where my hope is for that. But that's there are probably at least 100 fisheries manager in this town alone that would crucify me for saying that. And I hope that the journalists here don't say that I think that the solution to all fisheries problem is randomness. But I'm just saying we need to be willing to think about some really new, innovative approaches if we're going to lick this one.
Great. So I think we have time for 2 last questions, and first we'll be right there.
Stephen Lovink, Planet 2025 Network. Within the context of social media solutions...
Microphone a little closer. Thanks.
Within the context of social media solutions, I was wondering whether you were familiar with the Terra-Mar project.
Yes.
It seemed to be a very innovative approach to mobilize public support, be your own policymaker. And it's in fact an open invitation to claim your share of the ocean commons and participate.
GMAX. Yes, I am familiar with it. For those of you, are you familiar with it? It's basically saying there's a country out there that we all own, and it's the ocean. And the country's called Terra-Mar, and you can apply for a passport. And now you're a citizen of Terra-Mar, and with that comes rights and privileges. And I think it's an absolutely lovely concept. I wish them all the best. I haven't followed it recently, have you?
No.
I think it's wonderful. I mean, it's just such a great creative idea, and it's one way to actually bind people to that common in some way that is so abstract to all of them. And the lady who runs it, Ghislaine Maxwell, is just a powerhouse.
I have seen something that's been very encouraging, more and more people doing crowdfunding conservation research and conservation projects. And a friend of mine managed to raise his fundraising goal in just a couple of days, just via Twitter. So there is a community out there, if you can connect to them, who could potentially help you fund, for example, small, relatively cheap but grassroots projects, and sort of bring back Asia. There's a lot of projects that could be in Asia and the South Pacific looking at artisanal fisheries to make them more sustainable, to try and get food security for these communities. That could be done very cheaply and could be done via crowdsourcing with a couple of academics and local goodwill.
And last question.
I'm Richard Kennedy. I'm an economist. I'm wondering what the evidence is for Andreas's statement that lower fish prices leads to more beef being consumed. And lower fish price does give the consumer more money to spend on other things, not necessarily food, but other things in general. It's what economists call the income effect.
It's the income effect, yes.
But there's also the substitution effect, that a lower price for fish is a pretty strong incentive to buy fish instead of beef, and usually the substitution effect overwhelms the income effect.
Well, if you look at the elasticity of demand between the different protein classes, that's not what happens. If you give me your card, I will send you a really compelling 15-page PowerPoint that basically takes you through all of that. Okay.
Great. So I think we really have reached the end of our allotted time.
End of our rope.
We certainly have
Thank you very
seen
much.
great evidence of interest in the oceans, and thank you both. That was great.